And afterwards, I repeated to that particular state's attorney everything that the detectives had told me and everything that I had repeated back to the detectives.
But did you tell
As a result from that, I was charged with murder.
And did you tell your lawyer what the police, what the detectives, what Burge had done to you? Had you told your lawyer about the torture?
Yes, ma'am. I wasn't allowed to see my lawyer until the following day, November 3rd. I went to court, and before I came out, before the judge, my attorney came back to the bullpen. And at that time, I told him what had happened to me the day before. He instructed me not to talk about it or say anything else, that he would deal with it in court at a later date. Then he went on to tell me that the hearing that we was getting ready to go before the judge was just a preliminary hearing to read off the charges and to ask me how I pled. And I pled not guilty.
You were convicted, though, of murder?
Yes, ma'am.
And how long did you serve in prison?
I ended up doing 23.5 years in prison, with the last 9 of those 23.5 years did in solitary confinement in an institution called TAM Supermax.
How did you end up there?
The system felt like it was better to put me in a place to keep me quiet, because throughout the last 20-some years, I've continuously raised the issue about having been tortured. I was having hearings. So TAMS was designed for, quote, the worst of the worst in the Illinois prison system. Even though my record does not indicate that I am the worst of the worst, I've never harmed staff or inmates or anything else. But that was a justification for putting me in TAMS. And in TAMS, reporters are not allowed to come and visit you. You weren't allowed to have phone calls. So that was a way of probably trying to hush me up.
You got out in 2004 because prosecutors...
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. 2007.
But in 2004, the prosecutors dismissed the case based on these allegations of torture?
Yes, ma'am. But the parole board refused to release me. The parole board took the banner up and decided that I must have been complicity in some type of way in the alleged crime, so they considered me to be a parole violation, even though there was no evidence of such. So it took me an additional few years fighting the parole board in federal court before I finally won. And that's how I got out in 2007.
Flint Taylor, can you put this in the context of the 4 men that were on death row that eventually led to what we're seeing today and the moratorium on the death penalty that was eventually imposed in Illinois by the former governor, George Ryan?
Well, there was a very significant victory for the convergence of 2 movements here in the city of Chicago, the human rights movement, the movement against torture, and the movement against the death penalty. And what happened was that Ryan became convinced not only that men should not be given the death penalty and should not be on death row, but that there were innocent men among those on death row, and that they were innocent partially because they had been tortured into giving false confessions. And that's why he pardoned the 4 men that he pardoned at the same time that he cleared death row and commuted the sentences of the 164 men and women that were on death row at that time to life without parole. There have been many significant victories here, not the least of which is the indictment of John Burge and the fact that he's actually going to trial. But Amy, it's important to understand this case in the context, as Darrell mentioned, not only internationally but nationally. We sit here in Chicago actually prosecuting a torturer. That hasn't happened nationally. The administration hasn't seen fit to even give serious investigation to people like Cheney and Rove and those who tortured across this world in our name. And in the same way that the conscience of This country cannot be cleansed without proper prosecutions of those who approved and participated in torture in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and places like that. The conscience of the city of Chicago cannot be cleansed until there's a complete dealing with all of the issues of torture, starting with the mayor all the way down, and starting with the men behind bars, and starting with all the men that need to be prosecuted. So there has to be an understanding that what we're dealing with here is a microcosm of what's going on and isn't going on nationally in terms of prosecutions, in terms of restorative justice, in terms of dealing with the victims and the survivors of torture. And compelling the court system and the powers that be to deal responsibly and thoroughly and in a just manner with the whole scope of torture as an issue, both nationally and locally.
Finally, Michael McDermott, explain who he is, one of the chief prosecution witnesses.
Well, all these years, the first time that anyone who worked with Burge came forward in any form was in 1989, and a detective anonymously wrote me and my partners while we were on trial in a civil torture case, and told us about other victims of torture, and told us that other men, including those who tortured Daryl, were participants in this ring of torture. That started our investigation, and it started us to unpeel the 110 victims of torture that we know about today. But no one, that man or woman, didn't come forward publicly. It was an anonymous contact, it was anonymous letters, and we never knew who that person was. It wasn't until 2004, after the men were pardoned and we had lawsuits for them, that we were able to go out and talk to retired detectives who were black. And they told us, now that they had retired, that they knew certain things. They'd seen the torture box, they knew it was an open secret, they heard screaming, but Burge kept them out of the loop because he knew, because they were African American, he didn't trust them with the secret of the torture. However, when the government investigated the case recently with the power of immunity, the grant of immunity, they were able to get this white detective who had been involved in several cases of where torture was alleged, including one of a victim who was going to testify for the government. And they gave him immunity, and apparently, although we haven't seen the transcript, he reluctantly told what he knew about this incident of torture and perhaps others. Now, he is not a voluntary witness. He is not a happy witness. He is very scared. But we're hopeful that his testimony will be significant in terms of finally revealing at least one instance of torture from the inside and breaking the code of silence in that way. And if it is, and that's what his testimony is, then it's going to be obviously a significant crack in the conspiracy or code of silence.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. We will certainly follow this trial. It begins today, the trial of John Burge, not for torture, but for perjury and obstruction of justice. Flint Taylor, thanks for being with us, attorney with the People's Law Office in Chicago, and Daryl Cannon, who was one of the torture victims of John Burge's whole group. Daryl Cannon served more than 2 decades in prison. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Back in a minute.